Mike Brown, the former FEMA director.
Joining us here is the former FEMA director.
History, I think, was very unkind to you, my friend. Very unkind.
Mr. Brown, thanks for being with us.
This is Michael Brown Unplugged.
Hey, welcome to this episode of Michael Brown Unplugged. Glad to have you with me. So, I know it's been a while since I've been here live with a original podcast because of being in D.C. most of the last week and traveling. It really screws up your schedule, and I didn't have all the equipment I needed to. Anyway, too many excuses. I want to get to the impeachment. Impeachment, even though we're probably going to hear about it over the next 2 weeks, is actually getting a 2-week recess. So for this 2-week period, I want to lay a little bit of a kind of a baseline so that whatever you hear between now and whenever they get back from their vacation, their 2-week vacation, you'll at least have some sort of baseline to understand kind of objectively what's going on with this impeachment inquiry. There are two key aspects of the whistleblower complaint that, to me, require untangling, because these are factual questions as opposed to interpretations of either Trump's language and intent. And the two things are, one, the unclear timeline on aid to Ukraine, and the second one is the complaints about the elevated level of security or classification regarding the president's calls with foreign leaders. I think these two factual issues need adjudicating. So let's start with the first point, and that is the timeline on aid to Ukraine. The New York Times' Ken Vogel has reported that the Ukraine had no idea that the aid had even been delayed until a month after the call in question. Now, the foreign aid itself went unmentioned in the transcript. I've read that transcript word for word twice, and foreign aid is not mentioned in the transcript. And Senator Lindsey Graham, he's claiming that the delay was because of a Pentagon review that was supposed to be conducted by the Secretary of Defense and the NSA. That is a decision that was made well before the telephone call. So the question then, is all of that true, or is none of that true? What is true and what's not true? There's a lot of noise around this, but the specific facts matter. If we're to believe, we have to analyze the subtext of this conversation, lacking clarity in the text itself. Now, there's a timely reminder of Chuck Schumer's warning. Intelligence has, as he said, 6 ways from Sunday of getting back at you. And this is why I think over the next 2 weeks, it's going to be real important to understand what Gina Haskell over at the CIA, what the Secretary of Defense does, and what the NSA does in terms of giving us some sort of facts about why the foreign aid was delayed. Now, I can speculate all day long, but my understanding is that the president had issued a memorandum that any foreign aid to any country was supposed to be reviewed by the Secretary of Defense in order to make certain that, one, that country was entitled to the aid, that there was no corruption in the country, and that the aid was if it was part of an aid package, for example, to NATO, that all of the other member countries were doing what they were supposed to be doing. And I think, again, I'm not going to speculate, but if that is true, then there certainly was no implied, there was no direct or any other sort of quid pro quo in the transcript of that call between the president and President Zelensky of Ukraine. But on the second point, and the second point being the complaints about the elevated security and the elevated levels of classification regarding the president's calls with foreign leaders. Natasha Bertrand, who was a significant water carrier during the Mueller period, who's now writing over at Politico, ran a report on how the intel community folks think that it was unusual to categorize a call like this as needing some sort of higher secrecy. Now, the implication obviously being that the people around the president were trying to cover something up, except while that may be true historically for prior administrations, this author over at Politico also acknowledges that this White House started treating conversations like this with foreign leaders with higher security after the unprecedented experience of having entire transcripts of the president's conversations with the leaders of Mexico and Australia leaked to the public back in 2017. So apparently that became, that being the increased level of classification of these telephone calls became a lot more common after that. And I think understandably so, particularly given the president's propensity to, well, let's be honest, to gossip about other foreign leaders on those calls. And then I think there's an additional point that I think will soon become a factor. The New York Times made the decision to be the first to post the spreading details about the identity of the CIA officer who advanced this so-called whistleblower complaint. Now, the New York Times got a lot of blowback about that, except from a few people in a few circles. But the fact that the identity of the source, even with a so-called whistleblower complaint that is entirely hearsay. In fact, I would mention I was talking to my lawyer the other day, and he was mentioning that I had talked about that this was first, second, and third degree hearsay. And he was like, oh, no, you're entirely wrong. This is like fourth degree and even worse hearsay. But let's go back. The fact that the identity of the source, even with a whistleblower complaint that is, I think, entirely hearsay, he knew less about the content of that phone call than any of us by the time the complaint was actually released. That source, even though that source is key, it's a major repeat of what happened with the Steele dossier. How could we question the motives or knowledge of this so-called smart and well-sourced respected individual that you've never heard of? I think that really calls into question whether or not, and I hate using the phrase the deep state, but I really do believe it calls into question how much the deep state is involved in this new attempt. I mean, good grief. We've tried Russia, we tried Mueller, we tried everything. Now let's try this. I really think that's what's going through the Democrats' head. We're not that far away from the election. Good grief, let's just have an election. But the New York Times, whose reporters were deeply involved in propagating that Russian collusion hoax, reported last week that the new anti-Trump whistleblower is similarly a career CIA operative steeped in the details of American foreign policy and demonstrating a sophisticated understanding of Ukrainian politics. What's the insinuation? Well, the insinuation is that given his resume, he must be beyond reproach or any sort of partisan animus. But if you remember in the Steele dossier, Steele leveled shocking accusations of corruption and impropriety by Trump and the campaign team, going so far as to claim that Trump was bought and paid for by Russian strongman Vladimir Putin, who allegedly had compromising information on Trump that all but forced Trump to do the Kremlin's bidding. In fact, we've had a lot of reporters actually level the charge that Trump is just a Russian agent. But the problem is, Steele had not gathered or witnessed any of the evidence firsthand. He relied on anonymous sources, many of them third hand, such as, Source B asserted that Trump operation was both supported and directed by Russian President Vladimir Putin. I mean, that's exactly what Steele wrote. Steele also said, Source A confided that the Kremlin had been feeding Trump and his team valuable intelligence on his opponents, including Hillary Clinton. And then Steele went on to say, referring to the infamous and non-existent P-tape, he said, the Moscow Ritz-Carlton episode involving Trump was confirmed by Source E. Source F, a female staffer at the hotel when Trump stayed there, also confirmed the story. So I asked, does any of that sound familiar? It sounds exactly like the whistleblower complaint. When you compare all of that to the text of the author of the anti-Trump complaint about Ukraine, it's like it's a déjà vu all over again, right? The whistleblower writes this, I was not a direct witness to most of the events described. Well, just like the Steele dossier. The complaint is riddled with third-hand rumors, gossip, hearsay, all of which is gathered from similarly anonymous officials. I was told that a State Department official did this or that. I heard from multiple U.S. officials that such and such. Officials have informed me such and such. And it goes on and on and on. Much like the Steele dossier, the Ukraine informant lacked any first-hand access to any of the evidence he claims proves Trump's guilt. It must have been hard to blow an accurate whistle when the whistleblower was not even in the same room. That's what we need to watch over the next 2 weeks. Because I don't think, even though Congress is out of session for 2 weeks, this isn't going to go away. And I think if the transparency continues that Trump has been doing, turning over the complaint, turning over the transcript, doing all of these things, I think we're going to discover sooner rather than later that this is just as unfounded as the Russian collusion hoax was. Stay tuned. I'll be right back. So one of the things that's going to be interesting for me over the next 2 weeks is going to be watching the Democrat presidential candidates. How are they going to be handling this? Well, I think we have a good indication. Kamala Harris embarrassingly excuses the action of Joe Biden on Ukraine in a short 1-minute interview or interaction with a reporter.
If you're elected president, would you allow the son or daughter of your vice president to serve on the board of an oil company?
That was hard to hear at the beginning. Let me just say the reporter's asking, if you were elected president, would you allow your vice president, his son or daughter, to serve on the board of a company for which he has no qualifications? Kamala Harris responds,
the problem that we've got, again, with this issue is that it's a distraction from the fact that, look, as far as I'm concerned, leave Joe Biden alone. Just leave him alone on this issue of what this president has done that has been about corrupting America's democracy, being in cahoots with a foreign leader to yet again try and manipulate the election of the president of the United States.
Bad judgment, though?
I'm not going to be distracted by what this president is trying to play, which is a game because he knows that he is actually probably looking at an indictment and is trying to then distract from the realities of his behaviors that have been in violation of our moral, our ethical, and probably our legal rules and mores.
What? Do what? He's probably facing indictment? Leave Joe Biden alone. How pathetic can you get? A man in Schaumburg, Illinois, a suburb of Chicago, accused of driving an SUV through a mall earlier this month, sent frightened shoppers scurrying for cover, is now facing a state terrorism charge. Javier Garcia, 22, of Palatine, Illinois, was charged with 1 felony count each of terrorism and criminal damage to property, according to a statement issued to Facebook by the Schaumburg Police Department. The judge has denied bail. Police said early Sunday morning that the Cook County State's attorney had authorized the charges against Garcia. The statement says, the police investigation revealed Garcia was acting alone. A motive has not been determined. Police have no reason to believe Garcia was targeting any specific person and or store within Sears or Woodfield Mall. Now, the allegation is that he crashed a black Chevrolet Trailblazer near Sears and Rainforest Cafe at the Woodfield Mall around 2:30 in the afternoon on September 20th and then drove through the ground level of the shopping center. I think what has just surprised me, and I've got to go do some homework on this, state terrorism charges? Shouldn't terrorism be the purview of the federal government? I'm not one of these that necessarily likes the federal government having a lot of criminal statutes, but when it comes to terrorism, true terrorism, meaning that you are trying to inflict or impose your political will, or you're trying to change the political dynamics of a country or something, that's a federal issue, even if it's committed at a local level. I mean, think about it. Even though 9/11 involved interstate commerce because of the airplanes, it was a local matter in the sense that the World Trade Center was located in Lower Manhattan. The Pentagon, of course, that's a federal facility, so that was a federal charge if charges could have been brought against the dirtbags. Of course, we do have charges, I guess, against Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and some others, but again, those are federal charges. I was just surprised to learn that we have state terrorism charges for somebody that's committing this kind of criminal act. Because my question is, you're driving a car through, you're trying to run people over, what's the political motive? I can't find a political motive for this guy, And so far, nobody's told me that there is a political motive. I just worry that now the states are stepping in and trying to make state charges where there really should only be federal charges. Hang on, I'll be right back. As I've said many times, I don't watch the weekday morning news shows, the Today Show or ABC News. What's ABC's stupid show called? Good Morning America. I don't watch these news programs primarily because, it's a bunch of fluff and they're incredibly biased. An example of that is Good Morning America last week ran a story in which they claim that a new poll shows impeachment support is climbing. There's a problem with it, though. Listen to the story first.
It's great to have you with us. We want to get straight to the new developments in the whistleblower investigation that could threaten the Trump presidency, including new poll numbers showing how this story is playing with the American people.
Yeah, new ABC News Ipsos poll asking whether Trump's encouraging the president of Ukraine to investigate Joe Biden and his son is a serious problem. 2/3 of Americans saying yes, it is. But let's first start with Nancy Pelosi. You heard her there acknowledging that there's political risk here. I want to take another look at the new ABC News Ipsos poll. It says 63%, if you add it up, say that Trump urging the Ukrainian president to investigate the Bidens is a serious problem. Is that a solid enough majority for the Democrats moving forward?
I think what's interesting is the direction there. The number of Americans who think it's a serious problem, the number of Americans who support impeachment or at least impeachment proceedings appears to be climbing in the wake of these Ukraine revelations. And they're already higher than they've been at this stage for past impeachment proceedings. The proceedings against Bill Clinton 20 years ago against Richard Nixon both started out with minority support for impeachment. It climbed as the investigations continued, and this investigation is just beginning.
All right.
Let's just stop right there. There's no need to continue. So you heard both the reporter talk about 63%. And then George Stephanopoulos, of course, who is a Clinton lackey, talking about how, when you look back at Nixon, who was not impeached, and you look back at Bill Clinton, that as the investigations continued, the numbers continued to increase or climb in support of impeachment. The problem with the ABC News survey, it did not include a question about the respondents' support or opposition to an impeachment inquiry. Now, ABC News explained in a Sunday morning article about the results of their new ABC News Ipsos poll on Trump's phone call with Ukraine. But despite not asking about their support for impeachment, Stephanopoulos appeared on Good Morning America and declared that support for impeachment among Americans was climbing. I guess I'm just astonished. And sometimes I am left speechless when they are caught in such blatant lies that are so easy to check out. Now, they followed up with a serious question about the Democrats' lack of evidence for their assertions. If they cannot prove a quid pro quo, in other words, if they can't prove the president explicitly said to the Ukrainians, look, I'm not going to give you military aid unless you investigate the Bidens, does that weaken their case significantly, they wondered on air? And Stephanopoulos responded.
Let me ask another question that's sort of looming over this for the Democrats. If they cannot prove a quid pro quo, if in other words, if they can't prove that the president explicitly said to the Ukrainians, look, I'm not going to give you military aid unless you investigate the Bidens, does that weaken their case significantly?
Well, let me turn it around. If you find a document or tape or a credible testimony that the president did indeed say you're not getting the aid unless you investigate, that's a smoking gun on the equivalent of the tape that brought down Richard Nixon. I think it's unlikely you're going to find something that explicit, but it's not necessary in the eyes of Democrats in order to proceed with impeachment because they say it's an inherently unequal relationship. The United States, Ukraine needs the United States for military aid to protect against Russia, to help reform their system. If the president is making these requests, there's an implicit quid pro quo there because of the unequal relationship.
I just find that absolutely astonishing. Beyond claiming the poll showed something it did not ask about, ABC's poll also had a margin of error of 4.8%, almost 5%. That exceeds the standard 2.5% for the poll to even be considered reliable. If you don't think that we're about to embark on 2 weeks of propaganda about impeachment, ABC News just proved that. Hang on. I'll be right back. You may recall that last week was the climate change week at the United Nations during their General Assembly. Well, I found a clip from 1992. You know, the older you get, the more you realize that history repeats itself. We've made fun of Greta Thunberg, and we've made fun of all those rugrats asking these stupid questions. And, of course, you may have heard on the radio program the essay of the gentleman talking about how kids and parents today don't realize just how lucky they have it in terms of all of the great scientific and technological achievements we've made. But let's go back to 1992. And let's just see if we've made any improvement or if the end of civilization, as we were told was going to occur, has actually occurred.
Hello, I'm Severin Suzuki speaking for ECHO, the Environmental Children's Organization. We're a group of 12 and 13-year-olds trying to make a difference. Vanessa Setti, Morgan Geisler, Michelle Quigg, and me. We've raised all the money to come here ourselves, to come 5,000 miles to tell you adults you must change your ways. Coming up here today, I have no hidden agenda. I am fighting for my future. Losing my future is not like losing an election or a few points on the stock market. I am here to speak for all generations to come. I am here to speak on behalf of the starving children around the world whose cries go unheard.
And the cries didn't go unheard because the cries just continue, and we just keep going through the cycle. Wash, rinse, repeat, wash, rinse, repeat. It's the same thing over and over and over. A woman in Colorado, when Beto O'Rourke, Robert Francis, Bobby Frankie O'Rourke, made his appearance last week, it's a great confrontation.
I was one of the gun-owning Americans that heard your speech and heard what you had to say regarding, hell yes, we're going to take your AR-15s and your AR. And
Let's be respectful. Let's be respectful.
Well, I am here to say hell no, you're not. So with that, I would like to know how you intend to legislate evil, because it is not the gun, it is the heart of the man that does that. We all have stories. Excuse me.
Let's allow her to finish, please.
We can all have these stories. We all have the experiences. I was living in Aurora during Columbine. I had just recently moved when the Aurora shootings happened, yet I have very close ties here. Yet all of those people were there defenseless. They had no way to defend themselves against a crazed shooter. So I want to know how you intend to legislate the hearts of men and leave American citizens like myself, American mothers. I have 4 children. I'm 5'0", 100 pounds. Cannot really defend myself with a fist.
It's okay. Please allow her to finish.
I don't have my AR-15 today. I have my Glock. But you shouldn't have it. Don't worry, sir. I have your back. Anyway, I want to know how you're going to legislate that, because a criminal, by defense, breaks the law. So all you're going to do is restrict law-abiding citizens like myself. We all know that you, sir, have a criminal history, and I understand that burglars do not like armed defense.
It's okay.
Yes, sir. Burglars do not like armed defense, yet that is a right that we have that shall not be infringed in America.
I love it. I just love it. Those are actually the kinds of points and questions that everybody should be asking every Democrat candidate every opportunity that they have. Hold their feet to the fire. I'll be right back. And if you're looking for something to get your Rugrat for Christmas, I've got just the thing for you.
Kids right now, especially Gen Alpha kids, which are kids under the age of 10, they see gender very differently. They experience gender very differently.
It's a perfect time to introduce this new doll line that is truly gender neutral.
Introducing Creatable World, a doll line designed to keep labels out and invite everyone in.
The whole objective of this doll is eliminating all the adult labels that we put on it. From the kids, they did not want their toys to be labeled. They don't want rules set around their play. And what we heard from parents was an increasing concern about genderizing toys.
This will be really challenging for a population of people. We will challenge people's points of view about how they think boys and girls should play. It's so funny, parents often tell me that they want to raise their boys to be really wonderful fathers. How do we expect to raise wonderful, nurturing fathers if we don't encourage nurturing play when they're boys?
So Barbie was created 60 years ago. The benefits of playing with dolls, interestingly, has not changed throughout the decades. It's always been about storytelling and imagination, self-expression.
That I got, it looked just like me. It looked cool. Yeah.
It's important that kids of all different types can see themselves reflected in culture and media, and especially in the toys that they play with.
You know, I know an awful lot of men who are incredible fathers. They're nurturing, they're caring, they still retain their masculinity. Why is it that we have to emasculate masculinity in this country in order for a father to be nurturing and caring for their children? What is it about this? I think this is an example of where a company like Mattel, this is a Mattel product, decides to develop a gender-neutral doll, not because they think it will help men or boys to become nurturing fathers, but because it's an attempt at corporate virtue signaling. It's an attempt at somehow saying to the rest of the world, that small minority of the world, hey, look at us. Look at how great we are because we hear you, and so we're going to ignore the vast majority of these people over here who are our regular and historical customers, and instead we're going to try to placate this vocal minority. That's fine if Mattel wants to do that. You're a private corporation. Well, actually, you're not. You're a publicly traded corporation, so the shareholders ought to be upset. But my point being, even public or private corporation, you get to decide what you want to do. And I don't want the government telling you what to do. But I just find it fascinating that you want to go do this kind of virtue signaling that is clearly going to turn off and destroy a portion of your customer base. All in the name of what? All in the name of, so that you can pat yourselves on the back and say, look how virtuous we are. I don't think you're virtuous. I think you're pandering. And by the way, speaking of nurturing fathers, I bet every single one of you know a strong, masculine man who is a nurturing father that didn't necessarily play with dolls. And last but not least, you know that I'm a fan of CBS Sunday Morning, and I watch it knowing that they have a center-left bent, but most of the stories are based on the culture, and they're based on interesting stories and really good stories around the country. But yesterday, on Sunday, they interviewed Hillary Clinton and Chelsea Clinton because they've written a book together about powerful women. Jane Pauley, who is the host of CBS this Sunday Morning now, asked Hillary Clinton about Donald Trump. I was astonished this went unchallenged.
For Donald Trump's. Lock her up is still a big popular line.
I believe he knows he's an illegitimate president. He knows that there were a bunch of different reasons why the election turned out the way it did. And I take responsibility for those parts of it that I should. But Jane, it was like applying for a job and getting 66 million letters of recommendation and losing to a corrupt human tornado. And so I know that he knows that this wasn't on the level. I don't know that we'll ever know everything that happened, but clearly we know a lot and are learning more every day, and history will probably sort it all out. So of course he's obsessed with me, and I believe that it's a guilty conscience in so much as he has a conscience.
Of course.
I don't know that I've actually heard they'll chant "lock her up" at any of the recent Trump rallies, but I might be mistaken because I don't listen to any. I don't think Trump is necessarily obsessed with Hillary Clinton. I think he's focused on this current field of Democrat candidates. But what I find fascinating is, if you want to talk about Trump derangement syndrome, Trump won the election fair and square. There is zero evidence of any votes being changed anywhere, of any voter fraud on Trump's behalf. The Russian collusion hoax has been dispelled by Robert Mueller, the special counsel that everybody insisted was unassailable and had all this credibility. And then when he comes out with a big goose egg that there's nothing there, then they all start attacking Bob Mueller. At some point, we need to quit relitigating the 2016 election. We're almost to 2020. We're getting close to the very first primaries, just several months away. And yet, what does the mainstream media like CBS Sunday Morning do? They keep going back to Hillary. And Hillary keeps claiming he's not a legitimate president. Remember all those times that everybody talked about, Republicans don't think Obama's a legitimate president. And I kept saying he was duly elected. If you don't like his policies, attack his policies. But he was duly elected. And I never bought into the birther stuff. I've told you what I believe about the birther stuff. I believe he was born in Hawaii. But I think on those college applications and scholarship applications, he claimed to be a foreign student. He claimed to be a foreign birth, even though he wasn't. I think that's the fraud in the birther claim. Hillary Clinton, he knows he's an illegitimate president, that this wasn't on the level. Evidence, ma'am. May we see your evidence, please. Thanks for listening to this episode of Michael Brown Unplugged. You know the drill. You can download us and subscribe to us on Apple iTunes, on the iHeart app, or wherever you download your podcasts. Thanks for listening. Be sure and subscribe, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.